As we see, we've got our basic layout. Let me go ahead and open a file right away. And one of the things you'll notice is, of course, it is a DWG file. This DWG file is going to contain all of the same type of information that you normally have. One of the other things that's important, though, is how much flexibility you have with this data. For example, if I come up here to the File menu and I go to Save As, look at all of the different formats that I have access to be able to share data with. I can go all the way back to R12, DWG, or DXF. And why is that something like that important? You might have legacy applications or legacy hardware, such as old cutting tables, things like that, old printer routines that need that older version of the data. It's not a problem. By the way, you can also open DWG from any previous version. Now, if you've been around AutoCAD as long as I have, you might remember the days when it was all just toolbars and menus. In fact, I really like those because a lot of the times I just worked with the command line that's down here at the bottom. But if I want to see that classic interface, I can change my workspace to the classic mode. That will bring me, of course, my toolbars, nice concise presentation, as well as full pull-down menus where I can select all of the tools that I need. Now, if I want to focus on the newer interface, I can always pop back to my drafting and annotation workspace, and we can also save any customizations we want to this interface. Let's start the fillet tool. Again, I keep coming back to just typing. You can always, of course, use the ribbon interface to find these tools, but I'm comfortable just typing commands, and especially when the command line shows me all of the same options I'm used to. For example, now that I'm in fillet, it's offering me, do I want to do multiple fillets, polyline, radius? Let's do a radius, so R for radius, give it a value, and I want to fillet the polyline, so P for polyline, and select my polyline. There's a ribbon-based interface here where we have tools segmented by tabs, and within each tab we have panels. Panels with real file names, command names. Here I can display all of the options just like you're used to. Let's take a look at the interface. Of course, I just opened a file. So as a new file, it was displayed as a new tab. If I hover over that tab, I'm given the ability to go directly to any other tabs in the interface. I can also use the tabs down at the bottom of my screen like I might have become accustomed to over the last many years. It's no change. Over on the right-hand side, we have our palettes. So I can turn on different panels for our palettes or switch between them. I'd maybe like to clean this up a little bit, so I can just right-click and filter some of these out. I can also add a palette. For example, references. Let me move that up a little bit, and I can see in this drawing I have a title block referenced in. We'll take a little closer look at that later, but it does a great job of laying things out for me as well as giving me the properties. You can, of course, have these hide or auto hide, but just because this comes out of the box like this for a while, I'm going to leave this up to help keep quick access to these powerful tools. So again, you've got a very familiar interface. Things are very clean, very accessible, and very familiar. The next thing I want to do is create a polyline. So what's a polyline called in DraftSight? Well, I'm used to typing PL for a keyboard alias, and sure enough, that's polyline, and it's called polyline. So let's create our polyline. And as I move around, I'll continue to use the entity snaps that I'm used to how they work with perpendicularity and intersection. Here, I have my ability to put in distance and angle using tab, just like I'm used to, and just keep working in the fashion that I have been for years. I'll move this up, drop that in place. Now, as I mentioned, some tools don't have the same name, but the keyboard shortcuts do. So E for erase gives me a shortcut to delete. So if I press enter, I get in the delete command, as it says down in the command line. However, there are some selection options that I've been using for a long time as well, such as fence. So if I press F and enter, I can pick and create a line across objects that I want to delete. It works exactly the same. Normally, I just type Z for zoom, and sure enough, it gives me the option right in the dialog of what tools begin with Z. If I came down to the command line and selected in the command line and started typing as well, it would give me that option. All right there. So I'll do Z, press enter, and it's ready to do a dynamic zoom, which you might be used to calling zoom window. Power trim allows me to clear things out without having to pre-select boundaries. Here's an example of power trim at work, being able to clear out the information just by simply sliding on the screen. You can also switch it over to extend mode as well. What I'd like instead is to customize this, and I can do this just like I can customize anything in DraftSight. Coming up to manage. But what I'd like to do is switch that to 4, make it a little easier to track. So what I'll do though is switch this to see what it is, change that one. So I'm going to turn this off and start looking for my power trim tool, and then just simply use the pull down menu and set that as the tool that I get when I move down. So now when I gesture down, I get power trim, and I can just drag the trim tool across the geometry that I want to clean up. If I like, I can continue to use this, maybe clean up a couple of other areas in my drawing. And here I'll just swipe down without even looking at it and be able to clear that out very quickly. The workflow for these tools is also going to be the same. For example, I just want to put in the offset value. I can press enter or space to start the command again, put in a new value, and start framing in my kitchen. Oftentimes what I would like to do is ask you what your favorite tool is. Some people will get a little obscure and say things like, oh, I don't know, donut. And as I type that out, I notice that it understands what I mean when I say donut. But in DraftSight, the tool's name is ring. This works for a lot of different tools. Smart Dimensions knows whether it's aligned or horizontal or vertical without me having to tell it ahead of time. Let's go ahead and do something that's a little better. Let's start the Smart Dimension tool. Here, I'm just going to pick my geometry. Drop out my dimension location. And as I do this, I want to point out that every time I locate a dimension, this little icon appears above and to the right. What that icon does is it gives me access to overrides. For example, the ability to change the precision of my dimensions. I can make a reference dimension. I can even tell it to offset the dimension text, thus putting the text out on a leader, all while I'm still in the middle of creating. And of course, I can do any other modifications that I want. Now let's make some modifications. Let's take a look at the wall section. And I can see that not all of the boards are in place. If I go and take a look at what this board is, it's on the cladding layer, and right now my layer is doors. So either from the properties window or from the main ribbon, I can set the active layer to cladding, just like I'm used to doing. And now I'd like to use the pattern tool, which is up here in the modify toolbar. If I wanted to, I could simply type in array and it would know what I was asking for. So I'll use my geometry and I'm going to use just the same steps using essentially the same dialog box I've been used to for years to add in a pattern. When I click OK, I see my pattern isn't quite what it should have been, so I can pick on it and use once again just a grip at it to modify that pattern to get the proper range. Next, I want to go ahead and add a little hatching to my foundation. I'll start the hatch tool, and for those of you who've been using AutoCAD a long time, you'll recognize this list of hatch patterns. It's been around forever. I can honestly remember using some of these hatch patterns in AutoCAD 2.17. So maybe not all the way back to Lin, but pretty close. So let me go ahead and select my hatch pattern, select a specific point where I want it, gives me my boundary, fills it in perfectly, just like I need. All right, so so far I haven't done anything that isn't either the same that I've always done or better. So we're on a roll here. Let me go ahead and select my new polyline, and over here in the properties panel, it will show me all of the information about it. And I can of course manipulate it, changing the layer to countertops. Another thing that's really powerful is the ability to do automatic layering based on the entity type. So when I create dimensions or hatching, it automatically knows what layer that geometry belongs on, so I don't have to tell it expressly. We can see that we have a lot of different geometry on a lot of different layers. And of course, I'm the person who always draws everything on layer 0. So the idea of automatic layering is really compelling to me so I don't get in trouble. So if I come down to the status bar, I can see a TB Layers tool. I'm going to right click and go into the settings. And in here, I can see all of the different main classifications of entity built into DraftSight. And I can choose if there's a specific layer that I want to use, if there's a specific line color that I want to pre-assign, no matter what layer that I'm active in. You can make these modifications and they will stick as long as the TB layers option is on. You can of course switch TB layers off and just add geometry at in the normal way. Now I want to go ahead and open something that's a little bit bigger, something more of a challenge. Let's go ahead and open up our Expo Center. And yes, this drawing has a lot more going on to it. It also has multiple tabs, and I can open up an even larger file. I've opened up tremendously large drawings in DraftSight with no trouble at all. But what I wanted to do is take a moment to focus on the Layers Manager. The Layers Manager gives me my list of layers, which is very extensive in this drawing. It gives me my ability to activate a layer with a simple double click. I love the fact that the headings at the top keep me on track of exactly what each of these columns really means, what all these symbols mean. And having, of course, the grid makes it very easy to know what layer you're manipulating and what layer you're affecting. You also have tools across the top for creating or activating tools, and we do have layer states. So all the tools that you're used to, all the tools that you need are there. In fact, we even have shortcuts for some of the layer tools, and I love this layer preview tool where I can quickly just select different layers and make sure there's no stray data anywhere out on the drawing that maybe isn't in the correct location. Just keeps things easier. Here's an interesting option though. That when I create a viewport, I automatically want it to go to a specific layer that is hidden by default. That's really handy to have, so I'm not having to constantly go back and change the layer of my viewports. So let's take a look at an example of this. So if I come over to my floor plan, I want to go ahead and add a note. So I'll select text. I want to add a note to my drawing, and I'm just going to start typing. And automatically it's going into the correct layer. I want to select my text, set the height. I can do things like setting middle center justification like I've been doing forever. I'll override it with capital fonts. I can add any other overrides. I can even adjust the aspect ratios of the text and just simply drop that text in. And if I need to manipulate it, I can use grips just like I've been doing for many years. It just goes right in place. The next thing I'd like to do is come over to my elevations and add another elevation. So I can add a single viewport, or I can add a polygonal or entity-based viewport. Let me just go ahead and add a single viewport for now. I'll frame out where I want this. I'll activate the viewport and rough in my view. And when I'm done, just go back to the main sheet. Now, one thing I didn't do is really get that scale exactly right. And I did specifically ask for the viewport to be on a layer that was turned off, but I can still select it. So if I come up to the top of the properties panel and use select entities, I can say I want to select the last entity. And even though it's frozen, I can still select it and change the viewport scale. Let's move down to the garage and take a look at adding an exterior door to my garage space. But rather than just a door, I want to go ahead and use a block. So I'll use my insert tool, insert block, and now let's pick from the long list. I'll choose my exterior door. In this case, this is a dynamic block. And when I go to place it, I can say whether or not I want to type in a coordinate for its position, set a scale or a rotation, or specify some of these on the screen. But this dialog is completely familiar to me. When I click OK, I'll just place my door, rough in the angle. Now selecting it, I see that I've got the grips that allow me to access the dynamic tools. So I'll be able to change the size of the door, flip the direction of the door, and while it's selected, I can right click and use the context menu that I'd like to use. So I can even select move and simply give it the distance that I want to displace this door. Now down in the lower right, I see the sheet number isn't right. So I'm just going to double click on this, and this happens to be a block that is set into the page itself. Block attributes work just like they always have, and any block that you bring in that contains attribute information can still be edited just the way that it was for any AutoCAD user. Here I can change the sheet number, update the drawing, and everything's good. Raster to vector conversion. Sometimes we need to take an old drawing and make modifications to it, but it's been scanned in. Another tool that you should be aware of that we'll talk about a little later on, but we won't take the time to show you today, is the ability to convert PDFs to drawing data. Very powerful. I'm pretty much done with my drawing. There is one thing I would like to change though. It's that I'd like to have our logo in the title block. So I'm going to come back over to my references panel and just simply open up that linked drawing, that attached reference. All right, so let's go and bring in our image. We'll bring our logo into the drawing. Again, the options to set scale and rotation. I'll place this in. I can just use my command references, typing in commands to shuffle things around. Now what I'd like to do is use a power tool to convert this raster information to vector information. I'll go to Image Tracer, which allows me to select my geometry, and just that quickly, it's converted it to a series of polylines. I could also choose lines, fitted polylines, or splines. Now, there's some very fine detail that is in the DraftSight logo that didn't come through. The resolution quality was set to floor plan high quality. I want to set it to logo multiple colors. So having the option of not only bringing in raster information and converting it to vector or using it as a template to create vector, but having a lot of options as far as being able to manipulate that and control it is a fantastic capability that's just built in that doesn't require any additional install. Now if I hide the image, I'll see the additional detail that was added on the protractor and on the square. That looks good. So let's keep that. Now, one thing I don't want is for an image to be linked into my title block, which will be linked into all my drawings. So since I've made that conversion, I can keep this light by simply detaching that image. Let's go ahead and save our work. I'll just use a quick Control S, come back to our drawing, and do a refresh, and we've updated the title block. There are some subtle differences. For example, instead of object snap or O-snap as it's called, I get entity snap, which is E-snap. And if I right click and go into the settings, I'm presented with one single options dialog box for pretty much everything. For example, here in the entity snaps, not only do I get to pick which ones I want, they're even grouped into geometry snaps or reference snaps. Makes it much easier to keep track of. But I also have, through this options dialog, access to my file locations or system options. I can even go down into my drafting styles and go directly to modifying a dimension type. There's no tabs here, there's no separate dialog boxes. Everything is laid out in a very linear fashion. It's very easy to see what changes are made. For example, if I select dual dimension, the preview shows it to me. Keeps me up and running and gets me going very quickly. I've been using these mouse gestures all of the time. In fact, I normally have a very complex or a very custom application for it. So most of the tools that I used to use on the digitizer by hitting a button, I can now access by right-clicking and sliding in the direction of the tool that I want to use. So yeah, let's go back to DraftSight and let's take a look at that gesture. If I right-click and begin to move, I can see a group of tools around. All I have to do is release my mouse button while that's highlighted, and it will activate that tool. However, maybe 8 is a little too many for right now, even though it gave me quick access to the line. What I'd like instead is to customize this, and I can do this just like I can customize anything in DraftSight. Coming up to manage, I can see that right now I've got 8 gestures, but what I'd like to do is switch that to 4, make it a little easier to track. And of course, there's an enormous number of commands available, and every once in a while I'll see a blip where one of those shows me the direction. So what I'll do though is switch this to see what it is. So I'm just getting familiar with DraftSight, so I'm not exactly sure which commands are in what direction. Now I know that I'm used to using Control S to save, so let me go ahead and change that one. So I'm going to turn this off and start looking for my power trim tool, and then just simply use the pull down menu and set that as the tool that I get when I move down. So now when I gesture down, I get power trim, and I can just drag the trim tool across the geometry that I want to clean up. If I like, I can continue to use this, maybe clean up a couple of other areas in my drawing. And here I'll just swipe down without even looking at it and be able to clear that out very quickly.